Brass Tacks discusses with the studio audience the increasingly emotive topic of animal welfare.
Most little piggies go to market. Very few little piggies stay at home. When they're big and fat and juicy, they'll start the journey to your table. First stop, the slaughterhouse. To the meat trade, it's big business. To animal rights activists, it's murder. Tonight, Brass Tacks asks if animals have the right to live and if we have the right to eat them.
When we come in the mornings, on a Monday morning at 6 o'clock, you find meat is murder sprawled all across the front of the shutters in 3-foot letters. Over the last 12 months, we've had windows shattered and paint daubed over the doors virtually every weekend.
Are you a murderer?
No, I've never murdered anything in my life. All of our meat is bred for the table, and it wouldn't even see life unless we produced it.
Are you an animal lover?
Yes. I've got a dog, I've got fish, I've got pets. I don't particularly hate animals, I like animals. It's just that those animals there are bred for us to cut and sell.
Most of us, even butchers, get sentimental over animals until they end up for the chop. Now we ooh and ah at the sight of spring lambs gambolling in the meadow, but when we see them, we don't lick our lips at the thought of them being served up on our plates. Do animals have rights, and do we have the right to kill them and eat them? The cut-off point for the animals and our feelings about them is the slaughterhouse. Most of us prefer to forget it exists, but without it, there'd be no meat on the table. Every week we slaughter 81,000 cattle, nearly 300,000 sheep and lambs, nearly 300,000 pigs, 500,000 turkeys, and 9 million chickens. That's 10 million carcasses a week. It's an astonishing total for a nation of animal lovers, a nation which, on the face of it, would brook no cruelty to our four-legged friends. Last week, David Henshaw reported on those activists prepared to break the law in defense of animal rights.
These people are marching against their own species, other human beings. Their enemy is anyone who uses animals, whether for food or medical research.
In a war, you have to take up arms and people will get killed. I can support that type of action by petrol bombing and by bombs under cars and probably shootings at a later stage of vivisectors on their doorstep. I can see that happening. It's a war.
The switchboard was jammed after the programme. More than a quarter of the calls came from vegetarians who supported violence from damaging property to actually killing people. Many who couldn't get through wrote to us in strong terms to protest that the programme was one-sided. They said it focused on violence by animal rights activists instead of violence which humans inflict on animals. And this is what some of our other viewers told us.
Hello, Brass Tacks.
Hello, Brass Tacks.
After viewing Brass Tacks last
I would agree.
What I admit,
I really think
Talkback.
Whilst not belonging to the Animal Liberation Front or any affiliated organisations, I have a great deal of sympathy with the Animal Liberation Front's aims and ideas. I believe that violence against property is perfectly acceptable, and violence against people who perpetrate this evil and immoral trade is valuable from a publicity point of view.
The Animal Liberation Front have had a very bad press because of the violence, but if they hadn't brought about the publicity through the Mars bar scare, a lot of people would not have known about the terrible cruelty inflicted on the monkeys. I could never be violent myself, but I'm a vegetarian. I care about animals. Animals have rights. They're God's creatures. And I'm seriously considering joining the Animal Liberation Supporters Group.
Those that conduct acts of violence against the animal abusers or any human being defeat their own moral code. The fact remains that animals do have rights, and we have no right to use them for science or for food. But equally, the extremists have no right to take a scientist or an animal abuser's life. for the end can never justify the means.
Talkback. Whatever the morality of meat, there's no doubt there are powerful economics involved. Meat means money, and meat means jobs, hundreds of thousands of them. They're on farms and in factories, in abattoirs and butcher shops, nearly 1 million jobs in all. And we fuel that economic cycle by spending £113 million a week on meat and meat alone. But the battle is only beginning. These children are the meat-eating customers of tomorrow. The meat trade knows that these young hearts and minds have to be won. That's why schools are encouraged to adopt a butcher. Basil Bimson has been adopted by the Fred Longworth School near Manchester.
Coming into schools to talk to children about meat, to give them a better educational background on the products that we sell. Basically, to show them the different cuts, how to cook them, and what to look for when they go to the butchers to buy them. And never try to convince the children on the virtues of eating meat. I think they should make their own mind up.
Basil Bimson believes that meat is an essential part of the educational diet.
Which then gives you that, which is one that you see a lot in the butcher shops, isn't it? And then that gives you your middle neck. On the spring lambs, it will grill. Who would like to come and identify a piece? Come on. Right, you've seen what we've done. Followed it right the way through. Can you tell me what cut this is?
It's loin.
At lunchtime, many school dinners seem designed to give meat a bad name. There's little else on offer.
Get a cheese!
But some schools are now responding to demands for meals without meat. Every school in inner London, for example, has a vegetarian dish on the menu. There is a salad at Fred Longworth, but in the main it's chips and meat with everything. Children like it that way. They know of little else. Should animals die for this?
Let's just look at the life of one animal.
Lunch over, the class is exposed to propaganda from the other side, from the newly formed Youth for Animal Rights. Catherine Reynolds describes what happens to their meat when it's still on 4 legs.
Can anybody tell me how an animal is killed? Some of them are given electric shocks, you're quite right. Anybody know the other way of killing an animal? Yeah. Shooting, yes, with a captive bolt pistol. There are 2 main ways, but whichever way you do it, there are 2 stages. First of all, we stun the animal to make it unconscious, and then we do what's called sticking it, which is getting the blood out. For sheep and pigs, we stun them with electric tongs, which are a bit like headphones you might use at home, but they send an electric current through the brain. It takes 7 seconds for that current to go through the brain. Now, a government report came out recently. What it said was that many of these animals were going to their death, feeling pain and still conscious. In the case of hens, some were even being boiled alive because of the lack of care these animals were shown.
At the end of the day, the children vote with their stomachs, and most stay loyal to meat.
Well, when I see something on my plate, I don't really think of it as an animal. You know, I just think of it as something I'm going to eat.
Animals should have rights because they can't speak for themselves. Somebody's got to do it for them.
I think it is right to kill them for food because we have to live. It's survival of the fittest.
I think we should kill animals for food, but we should be careful about where we buy them from and make sure they've not been cooped up or led unhappy lives beforehand.
After seeing what happens to animals before they're killed, I think I would think about becoming a vegetarian.
I wouldn't be prepared to give up my meat to become a vegetarian because it's just like giving up vegetables because you've seen them being chopped down or something.
John Beggs is former press officer of the South East Animal Liberation League, which carried out a number of raids on laboratories and factory farms. Most of the children in that class, having heard both sides of the argument, in the end voted in favour of eating meat. Doesn't that indicate that you're losing the battle?
Well, I don't think it indicates we're losing the battle. That was just one example. My experience is that most young children, if they're actually told what they are eating, I think they will try not to eat meat. But of course it does illustrate one point, and that is that we're up against human selfishness, which is a fundamental problem.
But those children in that class, a fairly typical class, were exposed to both sides of the argument, and graphically the pro-animal side, and yet in the end they still wanted to eat meat.
Well, to be fair, none of them were actually asked to slaughter an animal for themselves. None of them were actually taken into a factory farm for some time and actually made to look at the conditions the animal lives in. And I feel that if they had to slaughter the animals themselves, a great deal more would have said, no, I can't eat meat.
Do you support the use of violence to achieve your end?
No, I don't think anyone actually encourages or wishes to see violence against anyone. I hope no one ever dies in the cause of animal liberation. What I would say, though, is it doesn't surprise me that certain people do advocate violence, because clearly the normal democratic routes have failed us abysmally.
If someone were to die, as you say, in the cause of animal liberation, how would you react?
Well, I wouldn't be pleased at all. But again, I'd have to come back to the fact that while the government continues to have such an intransigent stance, as was illustrated recently on its bill on animal experiments, then inevitably certain members of the animal rights movement and the public feel more and more alienated, and there's a sense of moral urgency. They've got to actually do something for animals, and undoubtedly violence will then escalate.
Are you putting animal rights above human rights?
Again, that's a daft question, if you don't mind me saying so. Animals have rights, but their rights are different from human rights. We're not asking for one puppy, one vote. That would be ludicrous. What we're saying is that animals should be accorded rights according to the kind of creatures they are.
Down on the farm, something is stirring, the conscience of farmers. Richard Guy likes eating meat but hates factory farming. His solution started 8 years ago when he bought a pig.
I gave it straw bedding and made sure it had plenty of space to mess around, and fed it on rolled barley and greens, basically.
And how did you feel about your pig?
Well, it's unfortunately true that I did develop a relationship with it, and I would recommend anyone thinking of keeping a pig to keep 2 of them and possibly call it after somebody you don't like. But it is possible to form a relationship with the pig. It became difficult to contemplate slaughtering it, of course, and some people would think maybe it was barbaric to do it, but I had to face the fact that if I didn't, I ought to become a vegetarian. I do feel that we've been put on this earth with the right sort of sets of teeth and so on to deal with eating meat, and it's part of life, and so I took the decision to have it slaughtered. After that, I kept more than 1 pig.
Did you eat your pig?
Yes.
Taste good?
Yes, it did. Yes, very good, actually. Once you got over that, it was all downhill. It was all right after that.
Richard's ideals are now the basis of the Real Meat Company. Chickens, cattle and pigs are reared according to a strict welfare code. It costs slightly more, but ends up, as their slogan says, as meat you can eat with a clear conscience.
The philosophy we've adopted here is simply that if the animal has access to daylight, fresh air, straw bedding where it can burrow and play, enough space to move around so that you don't get the pig equivalent of vandalism and violence, if you like, where they'll start biting each other's tails. And if we can keep the chemicals out of the food that are there just to make them grow faster, we will end up with a far more natural product, which must be better for the person that's eating it, and is certainly better for the animal itself.
In factory farms, pigs are taken from their mothers and kept in cages all their lives. Here, cages are for protection, to stop these newly born piglets being squashed by the sow. The rest of their lives they spend roaming free. Are your pigs happy?
Yes, I categorically state that they are. You can tell from the fact that they're playing and messing around and basically expressing their natural behavioural patterns, which they're unable to do in factory farms. They haven't got the room for a start, and that they live basically a life of stress. And I would say that the factory farm pigs are definitely unhappy.
Do animals have rights?
I think that is a question more for a philosopher than a farmer. But I personally feel they have, yes. I mean, I think they have a right to a comfortable life, to be able to express their natural behavioural patterns, and to a dignified end. And that's my personal philosophy, yes.
But you still kill them?
Yes, I feel that, you know, we are animals on this planet. These small fish are eaten by the bigger fish, and we tend to eat almost everything on this earth one way or another in various forms. you have to kill it to eat it, but I feel that if it's involved no suffering in the process, then that is okay for me.
Colin Spenning is Professor of Agriculture at Reading University. Do those pigs that we've just seen in that film have a right to life?
I think they have a right to be treated in particular ways, humanely. In other words, I would prefer to think of it as human beings having duties towards animals rather than animals having rights.
Couldn't we all survive perfectly well without eating meat?
Well, when you say all of us, I think there are some people in the world who could not. Most of us, of course, could. But I don't see there's anything morally wrong in eating meat. I think that if we decided not to do so, as a civilized community could well do, I would go along with that. I see nothing wrong with that. But we haven't actually decided to do that. And that makes it very different from a moral issue. You see, if society decided by a majority not to eat meat, I would agree with them. But from a moral point of view, I'm against cruelty. And I would still be, even if the whole of society thought we should be cruel.
Why are the animal rights activists now making the running?
I think you have to recognize that it is true that a lot of desirable change does not occur very readily. People are reluctant to move, even in desirable directions. Slavery, small boys up chimneys, the record is there for anybody to see. And it does take special effort, often by unreasonable people, to bring about change. But I think you have to recognize the price you're paying for that, and I personally would draw the line well short of violence in order to achieve it.
Talkback. As a farmer, I often wonder if the people in the ALF care about the animals that are bred for meat. We care about the animals, we feed them. If we didn't feed them and look after them, they would become extinct. And all the land that's grazed by them and kept tidy by them would revert to wilderness.
I'm a retail butcher. I feel strongly about the remarks made with regards to the battery rearing of poultry and pork. If this caused stress to the animals, then the animals wouldn't put on the meat needed. And if this didn't happen, then the producers wouldn't make the profits. With regard to slaughtering, we have the most humane methods of slaughter nowadays. The animals are killed quick and instantaneously. As far as the use of animals for testing of cosmetics is concerned, then I do feel they may have a point there.
I'm an insulin-dependent diabetic. The only thing between me and a long and extremely painful death is insulin, which is produced from dead animals. There is a synthetic version being produced now, but I'm quite sure it has been tested on laboratory animals and will therefore be unacceptable to the Animal Liberation Front. The logic of the Animal Liberation Front's argument is that I be condemned to death with 100,000 others and without a retrial.
Talkback. Mr. Watkins illustrates the dilemma. Animals died so that he and thousands of others might live. Are his rights as a human being greater than those of the animals whose deaths gave him life? But that, of course, assumes that animals do have rights, and that's our first question. Do they? Eric Allison, you were one of the many people, and there are those two here in the audience, who phoned us last week after the programme. Do animals have rights?
I believe they have rights. I believe that there's a law of nature which is higher than the law which, as Professor Spedding said, also allowed slavery and child labour. There is a law of nature which tells me that it's wrong to kill animals and certainly wrong to torture them before you kill them. If you want to eat meat, and if it's natural to eat meat, as people say, the chap on the film I think said that we're provided with teeth, etc., in order to eat meat, then go and kill the animal yourself. You know, kill it with your bare hands or your teeth, as other creatures in the wild do, and eat the meat whilst it's warm and feel the blood. You know, don't put salt on it and spices and roast it and hide it. You know, you're killing and eating living flesh. You know, don't mince about it. You know, that's what you're doing. You know, I think it's wrong, totally wrong. Yes.
Daniel Quinn.
Animals don't have rights. Rights are a sustainable thing. Humans have rights because they can tell you what rights they want and they can sustain them rights. What animals are entitled to is consideration by humans, not to cause them unnecessary suffering. But animals have not got rights. They cannot fight for them and they cannot sustain them even when they've got them. So we shouldn't be talking about animal rights. We should be talking about the responsibility of humans to animals.
Right, let's look at that. The responsibility that we have towards animals. Mark Gold, do we have that responsibility?
Well, the thing is that humans do have the ability to give their own choices of how animals are kept. Now, we can choose to live our lives as violently as we like, slaughterhouse conditions. We've had this myth that there can be humane slaughter. When a government report talks about, animals prodded in the genitals and anus routinely to move them, being hung up by the back leg and having their throats cut while still fully conscious. Now, if we have that responsibility, why don't we try and live our lives with as little violence to humans as animals as is possible? We don't need meat to survive, so why do we have to go through this great miserable process?
Paul, we have an abattoir owner with us.
It's only because people are so far removed from these things. They look at a picture of a slaughterhouse on the television and they think this is terrible. It's not terrible, it's normal. If they'd have been brought up with it, they would understand that it's perfectly normal.
Well, I'm a lifelong vegetarian because I was taken to a slaughterhouse as a child, and everything I've seen on TV and read about and have actually seen in real life has reinforced that early belief, and nothing is going to change it.
Yes, but you come from a generation, or a line of generations of urban people who have been removed from the countryside and animals and the facts of existence. And so, of course, you do look askance at it. It is strange to you.
No, I was brought up in a country town. I can't accede to that, and I do live in the country. And I haven't changed my views at all in any way.
Everything keep animals now, madam?
I don't keep animals, no.
That's usually the case.
But also, you got at this point, people keep saying, if they had to go and kill the animal, that they wouldn't do it. We had this argument when we were doing away with the hanging bill. There was thousands of people lining up wanting to do the hanging. So don't kid yourself that the people won't kill meat, and by them having to go and kill the meat, we'll stop them from eating it. It won't. What, why don't people kill their own meat? Don't be silly.
Surely cheaper than meat.
Because for the simple reason we live in towns. I have nowhere to humanely kill an animal. I have a garden. I cannot look after an animal in my garden. I don't believe in cruelty to animals, and never will do. But I will still eat meat. And this argument is, if you go out and kill it yourself, you wouldn't eat it, is a lot of rubbish.
We're a superior life form. We're intelligent and creative. And in our superiorities, the fact that we've got free will makes us the rarest thing in the whole creation. Better than animals because we're capable of abstraction of thought, industrial creativity, such as abattoirs. And that gives us the right to choose what we do to animals.
John Beggs, are we a superior being?
Well, it's interesting that the gentleman said that, because if you're going to use intelligence as a prerequisite for rights, then what about the mentally retarded in our society, or the senile? No one would suggest, and I certainly wouldn't, that we treat them in an inferior manner. Quite frankly, your arguments are exactly the same arguments that are used by racists and by sexists. They've got no logic behind your argument. My view is that it's sentiency, which is the prerequisite for a right, which animals clearly are. They are sentient.
How do you define sentiency?
Well, it's the ability to suffer or the ability to enjoy or be happy, and animals clearly have that. I don't think scientists would even dispute that.
Can we just move on now to look at the question of the use of violence to achieve these ends? David, who rang us last week, was the victim of violence because David supported a seal cull. David, what happened to you?
I had petrol poured through my letterbox. My car was set on fire. Obscene phone calls by the hundred. My children were physically assaulted in the street. I was physically assaulted in the street. Eventually we had to move completely out of the district to another area of the country, completely.
And how did you feel about the people responsible for that?
Well, I would like to give them the right and put them in a cage with a hungry tiger and let the tiger decide what right they had. That's the sort of rights I would like to give those people.
Linda, do you support the use of violence?
I do to a certain extent. It's harder to say how you support it. I mean, as it has been said, nobody has yet been killed. But when we talk about animals' rights, we don't know exactly what they go through. How do we define that an animal doesn't feel pain? I mean, to me, I don't agree with vivisection for any particular reason at all. I totally condemn vivisection. But nobody's been killed. I mean, when you say you had oil, etc., poured on you, what exactly was your supporting in the seal cull? What action, what was your involvement?
I put forward a point of view which differed from the, say, the likes of the International Fund for Animal Welfare. I put forward the view of the Newfoundland fishermen. the fact that the industry has now been decimated, that a quarter of their income has been lost. I mean, that doesn't seem to count with some people.
Linda, you say that people haven't been killed. Fortunately, that is true at the moment, but bombs have been placed under people's cars, property has been vandalised. Is that the kind of action that you would support?
I do support it. I mean, what is the difference between the wars that are going on in the world today? There isn't any difference.
We're talking
Everybody
about
has their
animals,
own
we're
right.
not talking about people dying in war.
I don't think there is any difference between animal and human life form. The fact that we happen to have developed further up is irrelevant. We live in a democratic society. Why should we say that people cannot go around blowing others to pieces because they disagree with animal vivisection? There's a lot of murder that takes place today, a lot less senselessly than that.
Your policies are not helping to get animal cruelty stopped, and I think that's what you should really address, because at the end of the day, when the ordinary person who's on our side, totally and completely, as most people in this room are, when they read in the paper about people inflicting violence and trying to persuade other people with petrol bombs and pickaxe handles, rather than help animals, they're actually making the situation worse and keeping it sustained. We have to persuade people in the first instance. In the second instance, when people are persuaded, when we go to Parliament and ask them to do something about it. And if Parliament refuses to do anything about it, we live in a parliamentary democracy and we can go to the ballot box and say we're not voting for that person, we're going to vote for the other person. That's how situations are resolved in a democratic society, not with petrol bombs and pickaxe handles, because it's helping these nasty characters who I thoroughly agree with you should be stopped. It's the way we stop them, but we should stop them by the ballot box.
Can I ask, ladies and gentlemen, how many of you would support the use of violence?
I would if it was necessary as an end result. Yes, I would.
How is this ever necessary? How can you ever say this is the excuse we have and all the troubles in the world? Well, it's got to be. Of course, there are innocent victims. No, why has it always got to be the resort? There's thousands more. I have never, ever had anybody give me. I know nothing whatsoever about battery farming. I have never, ever been shown literature. Nobody's come. I've had everybody come to my door and stop me in the street from A to Z on the pro-abortion, anti-abortion, National Front, this, that, and the other. Never, ever, ever has anybody come up to me and said, this is what it's all about. I don't live in some little tiny little bit. I live in Manchester, the third largest city in Great Britain, and I've never had it in school, I've never had it at home, never, ever, ever. And how dare you say that you've tried everything? You can't say you've tried everything because you haven't. It's just an excuse. If this won't work when we want it, blow them up. It's ridiculous. It's all the time. Violence has to be the answer.
Can we just ask John Bex, why has this lady not been informed? Why hasn't she been circularised? She says that everything has not been tried.
Well, I think that's unfortunate, and I think it'd be good if she was informed. Can I just quickly say that when we talk about violence, we've got to distinguish between violence against humans, which is you're mixing up with violence against property. And the majority of animal rights people have never, ever harmed a human at all. I'm sure most people know that.
But humans have been harmed. Humans have been the target of animal rights.
Yes, well, can I... property or animals. Yeah. You are
can I finish?
Can Mr. Beggs just finish, please? And then you can have your say.
Can I finish? The problem is, I agree with Mr. Corse that we need to use Parliament. It's a question of the carrot and the stick. We've got to persuade the public, and that's absolutely correct. Unfortunately, if we take a recent example, the majority of the population are opposed to most areas, not all, but most areas of animal experimentation. Opinion polls show that for the last 5 to 6 years. This government recently passed an act. It didn't ban one area of animal experimentation. In fact, it increased the numbers of experiments. It increased what can be done, which shows that democracy is a fine philosophy and a fine ethic. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked for animals, and that will lead people to break the law. It's not a desirable thing, but it's unfortunate.
John Harrison, RSPCA.
You evaded the subject of publicity a few minutes ago. If I write to my MP, I'm a crank. If 1 million people write to him, then he'll sit up and take notice, because the vast majority of MPs are only concerned with the political careers. And once they think they're going to lose a lot of votes, they're going to take notice. But I'll bring you up on your information. You evaded the question of information. This young lady behind me said that she'd not been informed in any way, and so have millions and millions of other people. The violent mob over here are getting us a bad name, and I absolutely detest it. Yeah. I've got old ladies saying to me when I go around to try and raise money for my little branch of the RSPCA, are you one of these violent lot? And I've got to try and justify myself, and I object to justifying myself because of this shower.
Well, Animal Aid, we've got 12,000 members. We're committed to a non-violent programme, as are most of the organised animal rights society. This is a movement about extending rights from humans to non-human animals, and it is by necessity must be non-violent. We want to extend the circle of compassion, and there is no excuse whatsoever for violence to be committed in the name of animal rights.
The trouble with the programme last week is it makes it seem as if the concern with animal rights is a fanatical single issue for a lot of people. And that is grossly misleading, because I have found that with many animal rights people that I've spoken to, in the broadest sense, it is one of the issues that they're concerned with. But they're also concerned with other aspects of human exploitation of this planet, such as nuclear power, decimation of the rainforests in South America, and a wide range of ecological issues. It is programs like yours, unfortunately, that make them out to be single-issue cranks, and that is grossly unfair.
No, they make themselves out to be single-issue cranks. They were the ones that put acid... No, yeah, I have listened, and to a certain extent you're right, but the fact still remains is they put acid on windows that children could touch. They bomb cars. They poison food in supermarkets. The people that are going to get hurt are not the people that are causing the pain to animals. The people that are going to get hurt are innocent children. And you can never, ever condone that. And even when people turn around and say, I don't condone it, but I support them. It's the same as the IRA, the Sinn Féin. We don't condone the violence, but we support them. That is condoning it. And until we stop brutalisation of animals and brutalisation of human beings, which is the same thing. It is not the same thing when we're talking about eating meat.
I would like to move on and look at the whole question that you quite rightly raise about eating meat. Bob, you're a butcher. What would happen to you if people increasingly stopped eating what you produce?
Well, like the car trade or any other business, it would suffer a decline. The figures that you showed at the beginning of the programme indicate the size of the industry as a whole, the large number of people that are employed, the diverse way in which they're employed, and things of this nature. And you asked earlier on, is it necessary for people to eat meat? Clearly the answer is, in the minds of the large majority of people in this country, and indeed perhaps the world, the answer is yes. And the reason that they do it is because it is a good, satisfying form of having protein. It is pleasing and very, very stimulating to eat, and on top of that, of course, you can't deny that it's been the traditional food of human beings since men have lived in caves.
Jim, you're a poultry farmer with 10,000 battery chickens. What's your view?
Well, it presupposes the argument that either you're a vegetarian or you're not a vegetarian, and we as farmers are simply responding to a demand. That demand is that 98% approximately of the population are meat eaters. And if the demand is there, we will produce meat. It is now our interest, our responsibility to produce that meat as in as good a welfare method as possible.
Mary Haynes, would you eat the chickens produced by...
No, never. That attitude, he just insinuates that because we like meat, we say that his methods of farming are okay. They're not acceptable to the people who hear about them. As the lady from Manchester said, you'd be much better to spend time educating people as to what really happens. I'd never eat battery farm chickens or eggs. I think it's inhuman. But people don't know. You say to people that they don't really know what you're talking about. They think you are some kind of crank, you know, and you're looking after a little chicken. But if people really knew the facts of what happens in factory farming, and pigs, they do feel pain. We all know that animals suffer. But I'm not a vegetarian, and I don't see that I have to become a vegetarian. But I get very angry when people insinuate that means I support cruelty.
So would you eat happy chickens?
I would eat happy chickens. If the chicken, I don't know if it was happy, but we buy our chicken and eggs from a farmer he does free-range eggs and chickens, and I would never, ever support the kind of intensive farmer that man is.
We saw in the film the experience of the real meat company, where the animals slaughtered are happy animals. Is that an acceptable compromise, John Begg?
Well, no, in my view, it's obviously an improvement, and I'm happy that they're doing that, as opposed to factory farming, but it's a little bit like saying we're going to keep the 3.5 million unemployed, but we're going to pay them slightly more benefit. It's really no answer to the overall problem.
Not to you it isn't, but for that.
But it's certainly not for the animals, is it? The animals, I think the animals would rather not be killed
Yes,
at all.
but people don't feel as strongly as yourself. They want to eat meat.
I know they do, because they enjoy it.
And you're not going to change that.
Well, you say I'm not going to change it. I
So
think
you can change the legislation that governs the way we farm those animals. That's what you should be doing.
Mark Gold.
just like to say that we really must get away from this myth that there can be humane slaughter. Yes, we have got to educate people, but the more people learn the whole process of what happens to farm animals, the more I'm sure that they will turn away from these. Just one quick point about jobs in the meat industry. Nobody is saying that we should not produce food. All you're going to do is transfer the jobs from the killing industry to dealing with vegetable protein, which is obviously going to be a lot less desensitising to the people involved in it.
David, you keep
Can we just
pigs.
make the point that as farmers we consider that is consumer choice. If they wish to do that, that be so. But by and large, the consumer still wants to pay less for their meat. And if they want to pay more, as we saw in the film, the consumers will dictate and the farming patterns will change to accommodate it.
We have various methods of producing meat or eggs or whatever. It's simply a question of choice. If you want to be a vegetarian, that is all very well. If you want to eat eggs or meat in a factory-farmed way or a free-range way, that's fine. We can do that. Farmers will adapt.
Bob the Butcher.
I must take one point up that's made by this gentleman over here. There's no such thing as humane slaughter. Of course there is. Clearly there is. The government insists on it. There's the Slaughter of Animals Act. Everyone that is a slaughterman has to take a licence, and that just doesn't mean you can slaughter. It means that you know how to slaughter, and you know how to slaughter humanely. If in fact you're before the court for doing anything wrong, you lose your licence. And all this rubbish about goads, electric, and all this, that, and the other is absolute rubbish.
The rules for being a slaughterman is to be 18 and a fit and proper person.
And know
that
the
can
job and
mean
be trained.
anything.
There's another point here which I think has got to be made. What Mark Gold is actually saying is that if you're concerned about cruelty, you've got to become a vegetarian. And I think that is highly detrimental to the campaign against cruelty to animals. If you're insisting that people have got to be vegetarian in order to oppose cruelty, you are preventing progress, and the prevention of progress, in my view, is equally as bad as this factory farmer at the back, Mark. You've got to change your attitude.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying confront people with the facts, and what will happen is more and more people will become vegetarian. But it is about education.
Jill Myers.
One picture in a slaughterhouse, one visit to a slaughterhouse would be worth 50 visits from an animal rights person. To a child of 13 or 14.
It gets those every week on the television anyway. Could I say, Peter, that much of this debate has illustrated one of the problems. We don't really listen to each other enough and try and understand the other fellow's point of view. Whilst we insist on criticising the other chap as though his views were entirely wrong, we do polarise the discussion. And I think it's more important to try and make progress. The democratic process does need to be improved, to take account of other views without forcing them to become extremists. What we ought to concentrate on is how you do this. Give the other fellow some credit for his moral position.
The truth is we shouldn't be talking about animals in terms of objects there to be eaten. We should be saying animals have fundamental rights, and they have a right not to be killed, whether it's in a factory farm or in a real meat company farm. And basically we're clouding the issues and getting away from the actual moral issue. And none of those farmers seem to have actually addressed that issue, because of course they don't want to, because they realise if people start addressing that issue, they'll all go bankrupt.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for calling us after the programme last week. Lest any of you think that the animal rights landscape is the preserve of the irrational and the extreme, we'd like to leave you with the experience of another viewer who phoned us last week.
When my wife had kidney failure, the only thing which could save her was a kidney transplant. But she refused the operation because it had been developed by animal research. So despite the best medical attention, it cost her life. But we had discussed the matter and were both determined that she should live and die by the principle of defending animal rights and refusing to accept any benefit of animal exploitation. I would do exactly the same in her position.
There can hardly be a more poignant and telling illustration of the depth of conviction aroused by animal rights. And conviction breeds determination. From Brass Tacks, good night.